Acknowledgements. In 1996, I came across the writings of psychologist and traumatologist Peter Levine. I recognized in his description of the phenomenon of the freeze response in animals many of the symptoms and features of my whiplash victims immediately after an accident. The persisting symptoms in my patients who failed to recover after prolonged treatment matched in remarkable detail the late effects of trauma described by Levine. I would specifically refer the reader to his book, Waking the Tiger, Healing Trauma, for a detailed discussion of Dr. Levine's theories and treatment methods for trauma. These ideas led me to redefine symptoms of the whiplash syndrome, and ultimately to my exploration of the somatic syndromes associated with trauma. I am grateful to Dr. Levine for writing the foreword to my second book, The Trauma Spectrum. We have remained close friends and colleagues. I am also indebted to the studies of numerous researchers in the field of trauma, the books and review articles of psychiatrist and traumatologist Bessel A. van der Kolk, and his personal advice about this book have been especially helpful. His extensive review articles on the psychobiology of stress and trauma reenactment provided a wealth of background information. The seminal book, Affect, Development, and the Origin of the Self, by Alan Shore, provided powerful support for concepts of the neurobiology of experience-based development of the brain in the newborn infant, with resulting alteration of brain chemistry and circuitry. A central thesis for this book. Through our personal interaction and his writings, Dr. Shore has been a mentor and a rich source of information. A book exploring auto-accident-related PTSD after the crash by psychologists Edward Blanchard and Edward Hickling validated my own strong impressions that the experience and neurophysiology of trauma accounts for most of the emotional and physical symptoms related to mild to moderate motor vehicle accidents, MVAs. This book also underscored the fact that MVAs are a substantial and relatively poorly appreciated cause of societal traumatic stress. I have also learned a great deal from the writings of many experts in the field of traumatic stress, and am very grateful to them for facilitating my travels in search of knowledge. I could not have been approached this topic and written the first edition of the book without the dedicated help of Connie Jenich-Myers, medical librarian at Boulder Community Hospital. Her tireless assistance in my pursuits of the literature addressing the rapidly emerging field of the neurophysiology of trauma was invaluable. It allowed me to expedite my education and to formulate my own theories of trauma on a sound foundation of knowledge of the literature. Finally, I perhaps am most grateful to my patients, whose stories, insights, and courage in the face of terrible pain have taught me a great deal of what this book is about. They have taught me that if physicians permit patients to tell them everything they have to say, then physicians are likely to know everything there is to know. The many case studies that fill the pages of this book are all true and accurate, although names have been changed throughout and the stories modified to protect anonymity. 1. Concepts of traumatization. The role of boundaries. Jane came into my office clearly in a state of distraction and fear. She had been involved in a relatively low-speed auto accident 2 months before, and instead of improving, she had begun to experience worsening cognitive and emotional symptoms. She had begun to misplace things frequently, had spells of severe physical weakness, had fallen several times, and had developed a stutter. At other times she felt agitated and fearful, and was intolerant of any stimulus, including noises, bright lights, and even simple conversation with family and friends. Even brief exposure to these seemingly minor stimuli produced confusion, anxiety, and ultimately exhaustion. When I examined her, she visibly jumped and then pulled her arms tightly around herself when I walked around the back of the exam table to examine her spine. When asked, she stated that she felt extremely anxious and uncomfortable when I stood behind her out of her field of vision. Even with a female chaperone in the room, her past social history revealed that she had experienced a physically traumatic rape at age 16. She acknowledged that she had always been uncomfortable when she was in a crowd with people behind her whom she could not see, in a classroom, a theater, or at a party. She usually positioned herself with her back to the wall. The benchmark of psychiatric disorders, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 4th edition, DSM-4, defines trauma as the person experienced, witnessed, or was confronted with an event or events that involved actual or threatened death, or serious injury, or a threat to the physical integrity of self or others. In addition, trauma requires that the person's responses involved intense fear, helplessness, or horror. Page 427, 428. In earlier editions, the DSM was more vague, defining trauma in part as a stressful occurrence that is outside the range of usual human experience. Page 236. The critical change in this definition is the addition to the concept of trauma that involves threatened death or serious injury. In other words, this concept now implies that trauma is an event or experience that threatened the survival of the individual. Examples of traumatic events that the DSM-4 lists include military combat, violent personal assault, sexual assault, physical attack, robbery, mugging, kidnapping, being taken hostage, terrorist attack, torture, POW, natural or man-made disasters, severe MVAs, life-threatening illnesses. Page 424. For children, developmentally inappropriate sexual experiences without violence may be traumatic. Page 424. Actually viewing these types of traumatic events or seeing a dead body may be traumatic. Learning about these types of events occurring to a family member or close personal friend also may be defined as trauma. When the trauma is inflicted by another person, it is especially intense, or when the traumatized person is extremely close to the trauma, the severity of the trauma and its symptoms may be especially profound. These definitions of trauma and its causes are useful and much more specific than earlier concepts of sources of trauma as representing stressful events outside the usual range of human experience. However, they still do not approach the basic premise that in all cases a traumatic experience in its intrinsic sense is one that represents a threat to the very survival of the individual. In this definition, the meaning of the experience may be as important to the traumatized person as what actually physically happens to that person. Being kidnapped, mugged, raped, involved in warfare, or in severe MVA are all life-threatening experiences and therefore potentially traumatizing. Photographs of survivors of tornadoes, floods, or other natural disasters clearly reflect the shock, grief, and suffering associated with shocking and life-threatening natural events. Witnessing a graphically violent event could be perceived as shocking and traumatizing, especially if the event had personal meaning or involved another human being. Childhood trauma is perhaps the easiest to understand, given the intrinsic vulnerability of the developing child to all types of experiences. Even learning secondhand about a severe traumatic event involving a loved one generally is a source of shock to a person. How all of these events may represent a threat to one's survival is less clear unless one considers the concept more carefully. We can basically say that trauma is an experience that is perceived to be a threat to life in the face of helplessness. And helplessness may in fact be the defining element that generates the neurophysiology of trauma itself. The concept of boundaries. We all live in a small and safe world of our own, defined by invisible but very real perceptual barriers or boundaries. These boundaries are formed by our collective experience with the world around us, some of which are positive or rewarding, some negative or punishing. Negative experiences are associated with pain, which may be as obvious as physical discomfort or as subtle as withdrawal of a reward. Perhaps one of the earliest pains that we are likely to experience is the disapproving frown of our mother to our irritating infantile behavior. The mother's negative response produces shame and creates perhaps the first boundary in the perception of the infant-mother connection. All of our senses, smell, vision, hearing, vestibular input, taste, touch, nociception, sense of pain, and proprioception, sense of joint motion, contribute to the formation of these boundaries that eventually tell us where we end as a perceptual entity and where the rest of the world begins. Our unconscious awareness of these boundaries allows us to move about in the world without literally impacting obstacles that are not part of our own self. We receive positive or negative information as a developing infant and child from sensory experiences that contribute to our unconscious perception of our safe boundaries. Painful or unpleasant feedback leads us to avoid moving beyond the boundary created by that experience, whereas positive feedback stimulates us to explore the area within that expanded boundary more. This sensory feedback loop continuously helps form and reform our boundaries based on ongoing life experiences and the sensory messages associated with them. We are able to develop a very specific awareness of how safely we may challenge the world around us. This perceptual concept of our boundaries theoretically could be a significant part of our sense of self. The more positive our ongoing life experience, and the more intense the associated positive sensory experience, the more solid our personal sense of boundary will become. The more solid our boundaries, the more safe, secure, and effective we will be in dealing with the world outside us. In many respects, this concept of boundary envisions a tangible, physiological, and perceptual entity. The role of boundaries in trauma. How does this discussion of esoteric and invisible boundaries relate to concepts of trauma and threats to our survival? We identify from our very beginnings those objects in our environment that are essential to our survival through the process of boundary definition. Obviously, the first persons we identify with are our caregivers, particularly our mothers. Through attunement between the infant and mother, we hopefully receive more rewarding experiences from these critical figures in our early childhood than we will ever again receive in our lives. We are able to expand our boundaries with our caregivers far beyond our perceived physical selves. Before the sense of shame is inevitably introduced, we are literally without a. This is accomplished through the introduction of shame as a boundary forming tool. Shame is usually first experienced by the infant in response to their own behavior that is felt to be excessive by the mother. She signals displeasure through a negative facial expression. The blank-faced mother in response to the infant's behavior, instilling in the infant its first sense of boundary definition. She then automatically restores the connection through approval with a smile and vocal reassurance. In a healthy caregiver and family environment, the growing child will experience a sense of expansive and generous boundaries. The child's sense of self may range widely and freely without risk of traumatic impact. The caregiver is always there to address the hurt, discharge the threat, and, in effect, rebuild the safe boundary. At the same time, a solid sense of where the infant indeed does impact the rest of the world is instilled in gradual ways through subtle negative maternal feedback. A strong sense of self and of safe boundaries separating us from the world around us gives us unique resilience to deal with perceived threats to survival that we inevitably experience in our daily lives. Using this concept of boundary allows us to understand why all of the relatively disparate examples of trauma in the DSM-4 have in common the specific concept of threats to survival. Violent physical assault in any form needs no rationalization to qualify as a survival-threatening event. The sense of safe separation between the assaulted person and the real world is shattered, especially if associated with physical pain and injury. Although a life-threatening illness presents a less physically tangible assault on one's sense of self, the safe haven of our body is ruptured and redefined. Once again, witnessing a violent event involving life-threatening bodily injury or death may redefine what constitutes a safe boundary for us, may shrink that boundary, and therefore constitute a threat to our survival. Boundaries and childhood. A child whose boundaries are evolving, ebbing and flowing with new life experience is especially vulnerable to traumatic stress. We are taught from infancy, by means of word, inference, or simple behavior, that our sexual expression constitutes the most private and central part of ourself, and therefore represents the most vulnerable zone of our boundary awareness. It is quite reasonable that developmentally inappropriate sexual experiences without violence might still constitute a threat to survival of the vulnerable child. Page 424. In addition, the child's caregiver and immediate family provide the child with his or her intrinsic sense of self and create the child's initial sense of safe boundary with the world. Death, critical illness or injury, or even the threat of these events happening to those important individuals seen as caregivers represent to children a threat to their own existence. The meaning of those individuals to our survival always persists, and threats to the existence of our former caregivers remain a threat to us throughout our adulthood. The most devastating form of traumatic stress, therefore, clearly occurs when caregivers, our intrinsic safe haven, the providers of our basic sense of boundaries, become the existential threat. When the maternal caregiver at times is also the raging and alcoholic abuser, when the loving father is also the source of incest, molestation, or physical, psychological abuse. There is no safe haven and no safe boundary between the child and the external world. The child's perception of self will constrict and shrink, with little residual buffer between what is perceived as a safe, bounded space and the unknowable threats of the external environment. In the absence of a generous boundary, the child will lose resilience and the ability to test the world, to take risks in order to establish a healthy sense of self-perception. As this child approaches adulthood, stresses and threats that might be considered trivial tend to assume the proportions of threats to survival. This compromise in boundary perception is probably the main factor in the well-known phenomenon of vulnerability to trauma in adults who have experienced abuse as children. The next line of defense, the next presumably safe line of boundary formation, lies within the expanding network of other members of our human species. The pivotal importance of those members of our human society to maintain our safe boundary perception gradually diminishes as one moves from less immediate family members through close friends, neighborhoods, tribes, cultures, religions, and nations. Eventually, human members of other tribes, religions, or nations may represent mortal threats. Nevertheless, those members of the human species, apart from our immediate caregivers, whom we still perceive to be closely related to us, represent a significant source of safe boundary perception. Therefore, trauma may be especially severe when inflicted by another human being. Trauma resulting from rape, assault, and torture is known to be especially devastating, probably because all of these acts represent a loss of sense of safety or boundary between individuals and members of their own species. Defining trauma as a perceived life threat in the face of helplessness, however, opens up a host of life experiences that may be perceived as being traumatic. I would propose that regions of one's boundary or perceptual surround might be altered by the experience of a traumatic event. This concept implies that such an area of altered perception will be vulnerable to negative stimuli from the environment, that is, sensitive to perceived threat. The case of Jane at the beginning of this chapter is illustrious of this concept. Having been sexually attacked from behind, her perceptual boundary behind her was impaired or ruptured, resulting in relatively benign stimuli perceived from this area causing arousal, fear, and panic. The area of the perceptual surround where a severe traumatic event occurred will predictably create a region of subliminal perceived threat that would constitute a boundary rupture. This has huge implications for trauma and its deleterious effects on emotions and on the body itself. This will be discussed in detail in subsequent chapters. Conclusion. From a conceptual standpoint, then, I am defining trauma or a traumatic event as anything that represents a threat to our survival as a human being. Threatened death or serious injury as defined in the DSM-4, but I will maintain that the implied threat is based more on its meaning to the individual based on prior traumatic experiences than its intrinsic severity. The mechanism by which traumatic stress occurs is by impinging upon or rupturing that intangible but very real perceptual boundary that separates our safe sense of self from the world around us. Although this, of course, is a theoretical model, it explains why the severity of trauma is worst with experiencing, less with witnessing, and least with learning about it. In other words, the physically closer and more intimate the traumatic experience, the worse the damage. The boundary model explains why even lesser degrees of trauma inflicted by another person may be a mortal threat if that person represents a vital resource in the formation of our safe sense of self. Finally, it illustrates the reasons why trauma is most devastating when it comes from persons or events surrounding those persons who are the primary source of our safe boundary formation. Our primary caregivers. We are basically left without adequate boundary perception throughout the lifespan if boundaries have not been developed in childhood. Under those circumstances, life may be perceived as a continuous fingernail scratch on a chalkboard, with a possible presence of a threat around any corner. I specifically did not address the issue of the person's response to a traumatic event, although, as we shall see, that response, whether it is to fight, flee, or freeze, is critical to how the individual's brain and body react to that trauma, and how it affects one's resulting well-being. I suggest that the experience of terror or horror in the face of a traumatic event represents a state of helplessness, which I also maintain is the pivotal state on which trauma is based. Terror and horror represent the state of impending freeze, the chemical and physical responses of the brain to trauma in a state of perceived helplessness, i.e. the freeze response, form the thesis of this book. As we will see, the concept of boundaries is also central to that thesis.